So I want to start out with a quote. And this is from Robert Coleman. I don't know if any of you know him. Master Plan of Evangelism is one of his main books. I read that as a teenager in the back of my family van on a road trip to Colorado. And a few years back, and a little less gray hair, I had the opportunity to meet him. He's really inspired me. Great stories. But one of his quotes sets up missional small groups in a good way. He says, "One cannot transform a world except as individuals in the world are transformed. And individuals cannot be changed except as they are molded in the hands of the master. The necessity is apparent not only to select a few helpers, but also to keep the group, say big enough, to keep the group small enough to be able to work effectively with them. The more concentrated the size of group being taught, the greater the opportunity for effective instruction." This is the Jesus model. You know, this book is from late 70s, 80s. It is a classic. And that's what we see with Jesus, that for Jesus, class was always in session because the world was his classroom. And he invested in a few who were there to invest in the many. So small groups is not about how many people can we get into groups. That's the wrong way to look at it. It's how many leaders can we empower who will reach their neighbors, not just get the existing members into a group. So very foundational, and it's something that crosses over every aspect of ministry and the paradigm that we're teaching here in the Acts Network. I'm going to move on, but for some reason I need to move this box. There we go. Okay. All right, and a few pictures of small groups of leaders that are being developed right now. And these are through the Acts cohorts, Potomac Conference, which is in the Washington, D.C. area, Chesapeake Conference, which is also in the Northeast of America. Excellent group there. And you saw Pastor Sergio will be on later at the group he's doing in Southern New England. Next year, we're working in California and further down the road, Canada. But the key is finding a few leaders to invest in, not just seeing how many people can show up to a training. I want to share this with you just briefly, my journey with Christ through small groups, starting up here on the left. I think I just share it not out of human interest, because I know my story may not be that interesting, but out of the power of what the gospel can do in a life. So at the top left, this is the high school I graduated from, grades 9 through 12 in the States. And when I was 15 years old, just starting out there was a group of older college students that came on that campus to mentor us. And they probably thought it was a flop because they only had one group with about 4 people, but I was one of those people. And the Holy Spirit drew my heart towards Christ and towards ministry in a huge way. 15 years old. This next picture where my cursor is a picture of Walla Walla Adventist University in Washington State in America, so on the Northwest. And I went to this school to become an engineer, and God radically transformed my direction, and I left as a theology major. And it happened because there was a small group of friends, 3 of us, that got together every Thursday night in the men's dorm. This is a picture of the men's dorm. And we studied the cross for the entire year. And we would start at 10 p.m. and we'd finish sometimes 1 or 2 a.m. on fire. And I became under conviction that this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. This is what God wants me to do, is to continue to study, learn, and share that with others. It's powerful. This picture here is a picture of Southern Adventist University in Tennessee. That's where I graduated from and did my last half of undergraduate studies. And while I was there, I went back, you see me moving my cursor, to this place, to the high school. And so it was a circle because those college students mentored me when I was there. And then when I came back as a college student, I went back to that high school. And it was while I was leading out in those discipleship groups that I met this lady in the middle. And this is not some random picture I grabbed from a beauty magazine. That is my wife, Leanne Rowe. She's from South Africa, and she is a psychologist that works here in Michigan. And I met her We got acquainted, formed a friendship over mission. It was a shared mission, shared ministry that led to dating, engagement, marriage, and eventually a few kids. I say a few because we are a two and done family. We love both. And then this next picture now is different churches that we planted. This one was started as missional communities, house churches. We met in parks, beaches, baptized wherever there's water, and formed a network of those. And today that church is led by a member that I discipled and nurtured. It's not led by a paid pastor, and I'll check in from time to time, but it's going strong. And then here I shared this picture before, the leadership group at another church where we planted. And it's all about small groups. You say, you don't think you're a small groups expert. You don't have to be. You have to be a discipleship expert. And when you understand discipleship, then you have the right framework for small groups. And you realize it's not just a program to get members in there, but it's about developing a few. Remember the Robert Coleman quote, keeping a small group concentrated focus whose job is to reach the masses. So just a little background for my story. Here's something that I put together, I call Foundations for Praxis. Praxis, it means the integration of theology and practice. So we could jump right into all the different ways to run small groups, but it's very important to understand this in our thinking. It all starts not with ministry, but notice where it starts. It starts with our theology, our understanding of who God is. And when you have that worked out, and I say worked out, whether or not you have an articulated understanding of God's nature, who he is, you live it out. You know, there's a quote where somebody said, William Farrar said that theology must become your biography. And if theology does not become your biography, then your biography will become your theology, which is a way of saying, whether we know it or not, we have views of God that directly impact our ministry and the way we treat others. But notice it starts with God, then it moves to missiology. So who God is shapes how I understand the mission of the church. And I want to say the Seventh-day Adventist Church in particularly. If you understand that God is a missionary God, then the mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is not to run churches. It's to reach the world with the three angels message. And that's more than a soundbite, because if that's your mission, then your view of church flows out of that. So the church is the vehicle through which God reaches the world. And you know Ephesians chapter 1, verse is 21 or 22, where it says the church is God's body that fills all things in all places. I like to say that a success for a church plant is not filling a building on the Sabbath day. Success for a church plant is filling your community with the presence of Christ 7 days a week. Maybe one of you could write a book or do a sermon series on the title, From the Seventh Day to Every Day. I think that would be excellent. That's what we need. So write it, put it together. But that's our view of church. But we only have that view of church if we have a view of mission shaped by who God is as a missionary God. And then the ministry comes after that. So that's really important for small groups to understand that they flow out of our view of church, which is shaped by our view of mission and ultimately shaped by our view of God's nature. So I think, Raylord, this is an important just background concept. So let me just pause there. And if you want to unmute, this doesn't have to be long, but just any feedback or comments you have about what you've heard so far. And feel free to share other perspectives. That's fine as well. I'm going to stop it and then I'll go right back to it. And actually, I'll put it up so you can see the language there. It says preparing slides. Oh, I put the wrong one up. You don't want to hear that twice.
Yeah.
Let's see, share.
Yeah, guys, feel free to share any reflections or feedback.
And we'll have more times as well. I'm putting it back up now.
Raylord.
Still did the same one.
Yes, Pastor Jerry, wanna share something?
Yes, I'm really impressed with that.
Small
You
groups.
need to silent the other unit.
Feedback.
Okay.
Ano?
Raylord, should I continue? I can't see, in my view, if anyone has their hand raised or anything.
Oh, someone's
Okay.
willing to talk now. Pastor Jerry. Yeah. Pastor Jerry is our stewardship ministries director, and yet he is still involved in Acts and is actually contemplating planting a church.
Very nice.
Pastor Jerry, yes.
Hello, Pastor Anthony. Thank you so much
Yes.
for the initial presentation of this presentation of yours. I would like to thank God for the idea that it reveals to me that really God is a missionary God. And I would like to say that this is a very impressive presentation and meaningful to me, significant. I like the idea, your idea of from seventh day to every day. I would like to develop that as one of my piece in stewardship emphasis. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll move on, but I think it's just an important background concept for any ministry that you're developing in your plant. Whether you're doing things in the community, your groups, a worship experience, worship gathering, whatever it may be. Those are the basic foundations from a missional perspective. And interestingly, these are the same, very similar foundations that we have in the Adventist Church, because the Adventist Church is rooted in the Bible. And so the SDA paradigm, this quote is overused on small groups, I understand. And if we had more time, we could go into a broader holistic view of this. But I want to read this quote to you in Christian Service, page 72. It says, "The formation of small groups as a basis of Christian effort is a plan that has been presented before me by one who cannot err." Old English, means error. But we have different ways of talking today. She says, "If there is a large number in the church, let the members be formed into small groups to work not only for the church members, but for unbelievers also. If in one place there are only 2 or 3 who know the truth, let them form themselves into a band of Christian workers." Notice the things I highlighted there. This is just what I take from it. There's different ways to look at it, but as I look at not only this quote, but different things that our pioneers said and did relating to group life, I see 5 basic characteristics. And so the first one is that a group, and you can use the term missional community, grow group, DNA group, DBR group, life group, whatever terms you use, but group life is the foundational organism of not only the New Testament church, but the understanding of the church in early Adventist history. And so I'm just connecting these points to what I highlighted in blue on the quote. She says the formation of small groups as a basis of Christian effort. So the very foundational, not only unit, but expression of the church. That is not an institutional programmatic view of church. I say this too many times, and you've heard it from others, but the church is not a program you attend. It's a family you live on mission with. And the only way that becomes reality, that paradigm, is if we structure the church in organic and movement ways rather than in institutional ways. So for Ellen White's understanding, it was the foundational organism of the church. Number 2, I'm going to pause after these 5 and ask for some feedback. Number 2, she says it is a strategy, it's strategic, but it's revealed by God. It's a divinely revealed strategy. I like to say that a goal without a plan is just a wish. A goal without a plan is just a wish. And we're wishing on a dream in a lot of ways. And this doesn't mean that we're not led by the Spirit, but it's a Spirit originated strategy. And so we don't have to go to all these other places to try to find the best practice, the best strategy. This is it. But it needs to, of course, be contextualized if you're in Manila, if you're in a rural area, if you're working among the wealthy, the poor, different classes of people. Number 3, third characteristic, it's member-led. I want to talk about this for a second. This is very important. And I am just moving my picture over there. My apologies. You can see I'm a wizard at Keynote. So member-led. How many churches have you gone to where they have a small group program, but often it's not member-led? It's pastor or staff-led. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Now, this doesn't mean that there's no place for pastoral staff leadership with groups, because notice the quote. She says, if there is a large number in the church, let the members be formed. So there is also people outside the members that are involved in setting this up. But the point is that the members do the work and take the leadership for it. I can't repeat it enough, but it's so powerful that if someone in your neighborhood gets invited to some church function by a pastor, it is way less attractive than if it's by someone else who does not carry that title and that baggage. And I've traveled the world enough to know that it's not just baggage in America or Canada, it's baggage around the world. Because, my friends, and I know not all of you are pastors, but if you're a paid pastor and you meet someone on the side of the street and they ask you, hey, what do you do? Are you going to say, I'm a life coach, I work with people? Some people do that, but I'm straight up. I say I'm a pastor. I'm a Christian pastor. And as soon as you say that, you know what happens. The keys start jingling in their pocket. Their vision starts gazing off into the horizon, and they're like, I'll see you later, which basically means never again. So it is way more credible and powerful when everyday believers with real world jobs, and this is what the Apostle Paul, this actually was the example, are engaging, leading, doing the inviting, and people feel much more safe and transparent. Here's a little quiz for you. True or false? Pastors make the best small group leaders.
False.
False.
That was like a softball question, we say, right? Like a question you would ask on children's story. I'm sorry if I don't mean to humor you. The reason is because we've been trained as pastors to be the answer man or the answer woman to everything. And this is why coaching is so important, because it's not about giving answers, it's about asking questions. And even if the pastor doesn't have an answer, sometimes based on their personality, they'll make up an answer. And that is so thin, and it puts others down unknowingly. So this is God's strategy, and it's designed to be member-led. So member-led doesn't mean the pastor or staff can't help organize it, but it means that the mission each small group does, they decide. You don't tell them exactly everything that they're going to do. And there's obviously different approaches on this, but this is what I found to be most powerful. They are deciding, taking ownership for mission. Number 4, let me move on. She says the members are to work, but it's for church members and unbelievers also. It's for both. So you're familiar with the one another's of the New Testament. This is the one another's all over. There's 40 to 50 of them used. And it is specifically between believers and believers to one another. But notice, if all you do is you could have a view of groups that is a foundational organism. You could understand that it's God's divinely led strategy, and it's meant to be member-led, and it builds up believers. But if you don't design those specifically for those outside the confines of the church, so to speak, you don't have a missional group according to the early Adventist paradigm. Are you guys with me?
Amen.
You basically have a holy huddle, and I've been part of those groups. You've been part of them. Our job is to lift up, not tear down, but those groups don't grow. They have what I call inflammation of fellowship. Ray Lord, I'm not a medical person, but inflammation is a serious thing. And if we develop groups without friends from the real community, we become inflamed with our own fellowship. And that's a very unhealthy situation to be in. And that's where you need an Antioch message as an anti-inflammatory to reduce some of the swelling. So that is one of the things that sets it apart. And many of our people are not accustomed to this. And that's why planting a church is the best opportunity to create a new DNA. It doesn't mean we don't transform existing churches, but you can start it from the very beginning. So let me give you just a little insight into how you can do this with your core team. Churches I've planted, whenever we develop a core team, we want to set a DNA of a missional lifestyle from the very beginning. So when you gather to do visioning and meetups with your core group that you're developing, your goal is not just to get to know each other, and it's not just to vision together and plan and all of that. Your goal is to check in and create a culture of encouragement and accountability around living a missional lifestyle. So one of the simple questions I always ask is, how is Jesus leading you to others since we last met? How is he leading you to others? You can, we have other variations of the question, but that's basically the idea. And so when you check in with your core group, you're asking each other, how has God led us to those outside of our circle since we last met? And that right there does more to set the DNA and the tone of the group than any book, any podcast, any field trip that you could take. So I want to encourage you, because if the members of that core group are not actively living that out, you're setting yourself up for a view of groups that will have the first 4 characteristics, and the 4th characteristic will only be halfway done. Because Ellen White says it's for the church members and it's for unbelievers also. And you remember the previous slide, that goes back to our view of God, mission. God's for the world, the mission is for the world, therefore the church is for the world. If we really believe that, then the groups would be for the world. So everything we do is connected between our theology and our practice. And then number 5, and I'm going to pause after this for some conversation. This is very interesting. I only saw this just a few weeks ago. I was looking at this, but it's a pathway. Small groups are a pathway to new churches, particularly in unentered territories. Notice what she says. If in one place there are only 2 or 3 who know the truth, let them form themselves into a band of workers. So notice above, she says, let them be formed into groups. That means there's a role for pastors and staff and elders to make plans for small groups. But below, there's no pastor. There's no congregation. It's a place in need of a faithful, authentic Adventist gospel witness. And she says, the members take it upon themselves to organize. That says 2 things to me. Number 1, the early Adventist view was of the members taking initiative to disciple. And number 2, church planting began with the formation of a missional small group. Do you see that? I think that's so significant and powerful, and even countercultural to the way our church often functions today. So 5 characteristics. They're consistent with New Testament, with our frames about praxis, and also in the early Adventist experience. So let me pause right there. And any questions, comments around what you've heard so far? Now, don't all speak up at once.
Yeah, you can unmute and then speak up. Well, let me just start, Anthony. One of the challenges that I see, especially for us in our culture, and you mentioned as a premise, the idea of groups, missional groups, small groups, goes beyond cultures. But I think there is an addiction for a crowd. There's really a especially for us, for those who are in the conventional work, we gauge success when we gather a crowd, and when we're able to to organize big meetings and draw a lot of people. Um, I think it's part of our culture. For us Filipinos, we love festivities. We got it from the Spaniards. So, and that is why it's challenging to step out of your culture, since, especially when we measure success, when we gauge success, it's by the numbers, by the count of how many people, joined, and not really the leaders that we were able to disciple.
Yeah. Very good. And that speaks to multiplication. Sometime if you guys get a chance, I encourage you to take a piece of paper and a pencil and write down 3 generations in your biological family, starting with your grandparents. How many kids did they have? And then how many kids did their kids have? And 9 times out of 10, that total number of humans is much greater than grandma and grandpa could have had on their own if they were really busy in baby making, so to speak. So it was a few that you developed with the expectation to start other families, which is the Genesis 1 creation model. So that has application to groups as well as to many things, certainly. Somebody else? Okay. Pastor Ray, Lord, in my culture, the teachers get cut off in mid-sentence all the time because there's too much that the others want to share. So this is good. This is teaching me a different perspective.
That's the opposite of our culture.
You might think it's rude. Excellent. Okay.
So
that's okay. Let's move on, and let me open it back up. I have one other key concept I want to spend some time on and attempt some other interaction around. And then if we have time, Raylord, I think it would be good to put them just briefly in breakout rooms. And I have something that I would like them to discuss. So maybe that might be a good approach to take.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So let me open this right back up. So we looked at, I shared my story. We looked at some praxis frames. We looked in early Adventism, just 5 basic characteristics. And again, this isn't a model. These are just things we want to make sure are expressed in whatever culture that we're engaged in planting in. And so next section here, I want to talk with you about 4 approaches to small groups or to group life. I don't use the term small groups because you may call it missional communities or whatever you call it, but 4 approaches to group life in an existing or new church context. So this is coming out of my own experience as a pastor, planter, as well as my learning, interaction with people in a lot of different ways. But I find that everyone, and there may be an exception, but I would wager to say that all of you in this call will take one of these 4 approaches. So the question is, which one is a best fit for your context? And are you going to make sure it's mission shaped, as I put at the top of the screen, not maintenance shaped? So this is just language I like to use for anything. Any ministry can be mission shaped, meaning it's not just for us, but it's for those in the world, or it can be maintenance shaped, which means it's really just about running the program and keeping the cogs of the wheel going. So you can take a very traditional expression of church where everyone has suits and ties. We sing songs from the 1800s. We wear full uniform. The liturgy is predictable. Even if you were sick at home on a Sabbath morning, you could look at your clock and know exactly what's happening minute by minute. That can still be mission shaped if it's for the sake of the world and you're intentional. You could take another form of church that is more modern, and you could come dressed casually. You could not use churchy language, but if it's not specifically for the community, it's still maintenance shaped. So it's not about the form or the methodology. It's about the intentionality that this is an expression of God's mission. Does that make sense? I think that's really important. And that allows us to embrace one another as part of the family of Christ, even though we express ministry and discipleship differently. So these 4 areas, this is the language that I use, and I grab this out of some of the teaching I do with the seminary students for a small groups class. But 4 ways that you do group life, and any of these can be missional. You just need to know what God's calling you to and what is going to work best to reach the people. It's not your preference. It's what will work best to reach the people where you're at. First one is conventional. Conventional is, I like to use that word rather than traditional, because those traditional and liberal terms have hardly any meaning anymore. But conventional is about sort of a predictable approach that we all know. And that's Sabbath school only. So this is a church, and I've pastored a district like this starting out, where they said Sabbath school is it. We're not going to experiment with any other form of groups. Some of you may be in this position. If we had more time, we have a whole thing we could do on how to make Sabbath school missional. Sabbath school originally was missional, extremely. We borrowed it from the Sunday school model, which had a purpose outside of itself. But today, often it can become who knows the most about this passage or about the lesson. So in that sense, what I recommend is you work, if you're planting, those who are going to be leading the Sabbath schools might be your elders, your ministry leaders, but every Sabbath school owns, implements, and executes on a mission of its own choosing. So one Sabbath school may say, hey, our mission is the local public school, and we're going to pull weeds, we're going to remulch, we're going to make close friendships with the principal and staff and serve them once a month. Someone else might say, our mission is our neighborhood, and I know in the States and a lot of places, if you don't keep your yard clean or you leave trash out, you can get a fine. And sometimes there might be a single mom or someone who just can't afford to mow their yard, or something happens. And so you let the community know, before you give a fine, you call me, and we're going to send a group of guys or ladies over there and take care of it and clean things up. You have your own mission, and the pastor and the church staff do not plan it. They encourage you in it, but you do it. And it's powerful when you do that. You can have Sabbaths where just the different group leaders share about the mission that they have. That would be a mission-shaped expression of Sabbath school. So that's the first way. A second approach to group life is additional. And this is where you have a church, either an existing church or a plant, that says, we always do Sabbath school. That's just the way it is. But in addition, we're going to have groups. It's additional. Now, in the groups, of course, that you have, you'll call them something else. And they'll meet on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever. This can be effective. One of the challenges, though, is that if you have a change in leadership, often people see the groups as additional, and therefore it's not core or essential. And when there's a change, they cut out the groups and they just go back to Sabbath school only. So that is one way to approach it. And you can have a mission-shaped expression of a church that has Sabbath school plus groups. A third option, and as I look through these in my ministry, I've pastored or planted in each one of these contexts. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I'm saying you got to understand what God's called you to. But and a third approach is replacement. And replacement is where you have one small group system, or missional communities, or DBR, grow group, whatever you call it. You give it a name, and you don't do the conventional Sabbath school. Now, when I say that, I hope I'm not judged as a heretic from North America. But God's church is big enough to handle different expressions, because our goal is the mission. Remember the graphic. It's not about the specific modalities we take. I don't recommend that you do this in an existing church. The only thing that will change is your job. This is why a lot of these more aggressive approaches are better with church planting, because you can create a new DNA, especially if you're working with a younger generation that is really in it to reach their friends. So replacement, I did this in a church that we planted, and we used the phrase, or used the term life groups, and somebody wanted to have a Sabbath school. So we said, well, if you want to do one of those, here's the mission. You have to develop and implement a mission inside the Sabbath school, and you can use the quarterly, but you'll still be a life group. You're a life group that happens to look at the Sabbath school quarterly lesson, if that makes sense. And so they did it, and it was effective. It wasn't big, but it connected with those from that more conventional background, and it opened up their eyes to a more missional expression of group life. Rather than telling them you can't be part of it, help them cast what they're doing in the context of the mission. Let me make another comment here about replacement. I want to challenge you with this, but that is the concept that our goal, as we all know, is to have groups 24/7 every day of the week. So if you want to have groups on every day of the week, don't label your group system based upon one day of the week. So if you want to have groups all week long, don't call it Thursday school, because people will only think it happens on Thursday, right? And so it's always puzzled me why we have a message that says, the members initiate and connect in groups all week long, but then we name our small group system based upon one day of the week. So this is not an anti-Sabbath school rant. Sabbath school is wonderful, but it's thinking strategically and about the use of language, right? We go back to language is very important. So I challenge you, if you're planting a church and you have that freedom to think about building in one name for your group system, and you could also meet on Saturday morning at a time that maybe typically Sabbath school happens, but your goal is to have groups all throughout the week outside of the church building, in coffee shops, in playgrounds where young families are, at the beach if you're near that, wherever you are. So that would be an example of replacement. All right. And then the fourth and final one. And so as I'm sharing these, think about which one you're in. Fourth and final one, I just call it radical. This is not a church with groups. This is a church of groups. And what do I mean by that? Because this phrase gets used a lot. The church of groups is not just a church that meets every Sabbath in a building and then they do small groups. This is a church, going back to Ellen White's statement, it's the foundational basis of Christian effort. It's a church where missional communities, or whatever term you use, are the primary expression of the church, not the departmental-driven programs. This is very rare in our denomination, but I can share with you example after example with the right leader in the right context. And then the gathering may take place once a month on Sabbath. And over time, maybe it'll develop to every week, and maybe one day there'll be a building, but the worship gathering is secondary and the group life is primary. Now, what season are we in right now? We're in a season with COVID where, to use a metaphor, this metaphor has been shared, and I think it's an appropriate one, but the metaphor of chess, right? If you want to be a chess master, and I am not a chess master, I routinely get beaten by young children much younger than me. But if you want to be a chess master, they say that you should learn how to beat your opponent without the queen. So at the beginning of the game, take your queen off the board, because the queen does all types of stuff. It zips around, it can take out rooks and pawns and do all these unique moves. Take the queen off your board, learn how to beat your opponent. When you can beat your opponent consistently without the queen, then you put the queen back on your own board and you're essentially bulletproof. And so the application to church is the question, what is the queen of the church? What is it that has been taken away from us during this season of COVID and pandemic? It's the worship gathering, right? It's Sabbath worship. This has essentially been taken away. And I believe, when my kids fall down on the ground, the goal is not just to get back up, but I ask them, what did you learn as a result of being on the ground? We're on the ground right now. And our goal is not just to get back and do things the same way they were, but it's to learn the lessons God wants us to learn. And I believe the lesson is how to play the game without the queen. How to be God's mission and be God's church when the queen's been taken off the board. If we can learn that, and this is a more radical approach that I have on the screen, then one day when it is returned, and it will be returned, we will look at it from a different perspective. It doesn't mean we won't come together in a big group to worship God and to praise him, but we'll have something much deeper than just the gathering. So I think it's a great metaphor to play with during the season. As I mentioned, I've been involved with all 4 of these types, and each one can have a missional expression, and it can have a more maintenance or institutional expression. I know church plants that are doing the radical example of a church of groups, but when you visit the groups, it's all just the members that were either disgruntled or had a bad experience with the church, and you don't really see close friendship taking place outside of that circle. So conventional, Sabbath school only, additional, Sabbath school plus groups, replacement, where you have one small group system, and then the last one, radical, a church of groups, where the gathering is not primary. It still happens, but the groups are the primary expression, and you don't have a departmental-driven leadership team like we often have the expectation of in our system. So let me pause there now, and I want to, let's see what time we're at. Raylord, how much time is left? It says 2 minutes. So do you want to, what do you recommend? I have a few other slides, but I'm just going to pass on it to keep on time. So do you recommend just a group feedback or into the breakout rooms?
No, we can do a group feedback. Anyone from the floor can.
Okay.
Yeah. Can share.
Simple. Okay.
Yeah.
So if everybody has that written down, or Raylord, if it's possible for you or someone else to put those 4 basic approaches in the chat, I'm going to stop share and let's take some feedback on what you've heard.
Okay. All right. Just unmute if you have, somebody share some feedback.
Coach.
Yes, yeah.
I think this session made me realize that small group is the root. It's the foundation, and we've neglected the roots and focused on the fruits without nurturing the roots. So the result, we've chased the fruits without watering the roots. Kaya this really struck me na we should return to not just creating small groups, but creating church of groups.
Thank you. I think many of us find ourselves in the conventional. Some of you are going, through experimentation and trying to add groups outside. Well, maybe just so you know, Anthony, in our context, especially in the conference, there is this massive program, right, on implementing small groups. We call them care groups here, right? But the focus is really activating the Sabbath school classes, and that is why we transform them into, we call them now Sabbath school care groups. I think they fall on to additional. So allowing a little leeway for those who are meeting outside the church and outside the Sabbath, right? So mainly we're on that context, the additional, okay, Sabbath school plus groups.
And I think there's a whole nother thing that we could have done if we had more time on the tensions of group life in the Seventh-day Adventist culture. And this is, I think, what you're speaking to. And one of the tensions is program-driven ministries, small group missions, or both. And it makes it very difficult for group life to own and execute on their own mission when the leaders of the small groups are often the leaders of different departments in the local church. So this goes back to the praxis graphic I was sharing earlier. What really is our understanding of the mission of God and the church? And, you know, I like to say you can't solve institutional problems with administrative solutions.
Got it. Yeah.
And we have to we have to live with reality where we're at. We don't live in an ideal world where we're just off in the middle doing our own thing. That's not what I'm suggesting. But if you have fundamentally an institutional view of the church, the program-driven response, you can't do both on a conference level or a church or a local church level, because it really burns. It burns our people out. So how can we lower the bar on what it means to be a church? And this is where we could talk about minimal ecclesiology in order to raise the bar on what it means to be a disciple. Otherwise, I've seen it time and time again. We have these understandings of a church of groups and we start moving towards it, but we haven't practiced subtraction. And this is a very challenging situation. And I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. And that is why I agree when you said earlier that, you know, missional groups or primary groups, group life thrives best in church plants, because you can inject, you know, a new DNA, introduce new values that we can hardly do in established, much more in a century-old church. I've tried it. I have also tried it, but it also faded away. There's an excitement at the beginning, but since there's already a there's already a set of values in place, it's so hard to reorient people to become more missional. Anyone else?
So that's,
Coach?
Yes.
Yeah. Hello, Pastor Anthony. My question is, what can you advise for a church like us? Actually, we're looking at the possibility of having that group within a group, small groups in the church. And I'm just thinking, if not all the members do not understand yet that idea, how would you transition into that say
paradigm?
aspect?
Yeah. I'll keep it less than 1 minute. There's no set answer, but there's a number of things that I think transfer across culture. And these are things I'm sharing from experience, not from a theory. But anytime you go to make a change like that, and I understand the context you're describing, make yourself 2 columns and pray and think through very carefully what it means to bring about that kind of change, both organically and organizationally. So this is what an exercise I'll do with teams a lot, is just make 2 columns on a screen, a whiteboard, or a paper, and one side put organic and the other side put organizational. So organic is, what are the organic things that we can and should be doing to relationally influence people and connect with them and inspire them and take them on a field trip and open up a new paradigm. The other side is organizational. And what often happens with change is we try to do organizational change, which is what are the votes that need to happen? What are the policy or the protocol? What is the structure that needs to take place? We try to do organizational change before we've done the deeper work of organic change, which is not just our work, it's a fruit of the Spirit. And so work on both of those. So if you're going to implement, like you're talking about with some small groups, what are those 2 different areas? And I don't want to take more time. We have another presenter or presentation coming up. But I'd be happy to dialogue about that further, and we have other things on that we could do with the transition.
Thank you. Thank you.